We're going to start. We're going to start. We're going to start with our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Dr. Carlton, and Dr. Carlton Turner is a lecturer in contextual theology at the Queen's Theological Foundation in Birmingham, and does lots of work there and with the Center of Black Theology. It's a pleasure of mine to be chair of the advisory committee there, and he's got a lot of insight around this issue of maleness and masculinity, particularly informed from an African and Caribbean context, but can speak to the subject generically and generally as well. And he believes that as an African Caribbean conceptual theologian, he's concerned with the issues around Black and Caribbean identity and culture and the ways these influence and are influencing our concepts of God. So this morning, Dr. Carlton, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us, and we'll give you the first 15 minutes just to share some reflections on masculinity. Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Carlton.
Thank you very much, David, and it's a pleasure to be here. I have a few things to say, but I won't be late. Let's just get on with it. Happy New Year to everyone. Before I get deeper into this reflection on men, there are some things I just want to clear up first and then come back to it for a deeper reflection. Firstly, when talking about men, this is a complex topic. There are images of the typical man or the ideal man, and maybe we think that includes lots of brawn or sharp intelligence or some kind of ruggedness or being unreactive or unemotional in our stance. That's just not the case. We are more complex than that. Secondly, we can't just think about biological sex as the thing that determines who and what a man is. Human beings, including men, have complex psychological and emotional lives. Even biological sex is a very complex thing. If anyone knows anything about analytical psychology, you know that the psyche has male and female parts, and even those don't describe it well enough. And that identity and also gender is complex. And whoever we are, there's a part of us that is innate, and there's a part of us that is simply performed and learned along the way. And we have to wrestle with the fact that there are people who simply do not describe to our notions of what male or female is. But does that make them any less human? Thirdly, we simply cannot dismiss markers of maleness either. I cannot dismiss myself. There is an ancient, and not just a biblical one, but an ancient human idea, view of God, that God created male and female, and both are important in God's created order. From the animal kingdom generally and human beings in particular, this is just simply something we see. And we have had to pause and take stock of how we have neglected women and framed women in oppressive ways. But we must do the same for men. Men and being male or masculine matters. It matters greatly. But what it means and how this is carried out needs reflection. Let's start with the Bible. I guess the place to give reflection is the whole range of scripture, and I'll pick out some things first. When we read the Bible, we are reading about life in very patriarchal societies, wherein men had very special places, and women were seen in many ways as supporting voices, not exclusively, but a broad range. They were simply supporting voices, and it's easy to read stories in the Bible to see this example. Let me take some examples for you. David, we see him as king and fierce warrior. Abraham and his two heirs, Isaac and Ishmael, these two would become fathers of two world faiths. Jesus and his 12 male disciples and their place in the beginning of the Christian movement, or even how we see God as father, masculine, son, masculine. The image of masculinity predominates scripture, but scripture is much more complex than this. Let's take these very same examples in turn. David is a poet. David dances. David is lover. David is sinner. David seems to have a childhood of rejection and abandonment. He forms deep friendships with Jonathan. David seeks love and validation from Saul. He grows into pride and violence. He is complex and problematic, and we just cannot gloss over him. He is not just one thing. Abraham and his heirs, they get the place of central characters in this story of Abraham. But those sons come from complex relationships between Abraham and his harem. The two main women in this story play significant roles in the outcome of Abraham's heirs and the birth of two religions and how they are conceived. They are not simply men in this story, they are sons and brothers and members of what seems to be a very, very toxic family system. Let's go to Jesus and his 12 disciples. There's so much to say here. Jesus is born male, but consistently he just does not live according to how his culture believed masculinity should be performed. For example, as teacher, he was to be powerful and punitive with those who went against him. However, we see Jesus hanging out with sinners and tax collectors, allowing his disciples to break the laws on the Sabbath when they were hungry, failing to condemn a woman caught in adultery, giving a place at his table to his betrayer, and crying out for forgiveness for his enemies from the cross. His disciples are men of all kinds and of all kinds of personalities. They are a random bunch of people who are far from perfect, often afraid, insecure, and eventually disloyal. Yet they grow into something beautiful and something holy. And furthermore, we have to add that women, whether we like it or not, were also part of Jesus's inner circle. Let's go to God. It's easy to see God as male. We have images of the white old man with the white long beard in the sky. God knows where we got that from. But this is not biblical. And yes, Yahweh, or the unspeakable name of God in the Old Testament, is thought of in ways that suggest maleness. For example, the Lord is my shepherd in Psalm 23. The Lord is the warrior of Israel, fierce in battles from Exodus 15. But earliest accounts speak of El Shaddai, the breasted one. We refer to it as the Almighty. That's how we have translated it. But there's a profound imagery in Exodus of a God who nurtures and sustains and upholds. It is deeply maternal. Also, Jesus is born as a man. He says things like, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." This is Matthew 23. And what do you make of the Holy Spirit? The Spirit that leads into all truth, that cannot be easily defined. Our ideas of masculinity, femininity will never do justice to understanding who the Spirit of God is. In fact, our understanding of gender will never do justice to who God is. Let's go a bit deeper. Masculinity and patriarchal legacies. I need to say something about this. We have to consider that the legacies of patriarchy and its version of masculinity have always been problematic. We now use the term toxic masculinity. And to my mind, we are talking about a way of seeing the world, which is about how power is used. A patriarchal system holds that men are at the center, the leaders, the primary ones, and that being male by virtue of biology grants them a certain leadership or headship. We use these terms. This means that women inherently, because of who they are, play a secondary role and are seen as not fit for this kind of headship. And we see this inscribed in our language. God came to save mankind, for example. And it gets worse. Toxic masculinity and patriarchal systems structure a world in which women are marginalized, oppressed, underrepresented, boxed in, and abused. It is all because of a very binary approach to life where power is used to keep men as the status quo. This kind of system has proven violent in all sorts of ways. However, what I want to say very clearly here is that patriarchal systems are inherently violent against men also. We're talking about a system that shapes us, a system that holds one particular model of masculinity is harmful to the full experience of being male. I was involved in a book project on sexual abuse and the way we understand Jesus's crucifixion. And the book is called When Did We See You Naked? Jesus as victim of sexual abuse. And that's not an easy thing to think about. And I know that's hard for many people to conceive. But I came away with some important insights. Firstly, crucifixion within the Roman colonial world was about suppressing otherness and threat in the most brutal, sexual, and public way. It was meant to demean, to shame, and to dehumanize. It was part of a system of state terror that traumatized those who needed to be kept in line. And what's interesting that it also traumatized the soldiers, mainly men, who had to carry out these public killings. In fact, they were kept in line through the same violent means. And secondly, one of the truths that isn't so easily discussed within the African Caribbean context that I know best, where plantation slavery shaped the region, is that there's a legacy of domestic and sexual abuse that has impacted both men and women, boys and girls, and is not often addressed, especially in our churches. Men are vulnerable. They're vulnerable too. Movember, I don't know if you know this movement of Movember, moving in November, but it's the symbol with the bear going on walks in support of the well-being of men. I recently walked with a friend who was raising money for Movember, M-O-V-E-M-B-E-R. And it is about the fact that men are dying prematurely and experiencing mental and physical health crises and are increasingly taking their own lives. From their website, globally, on average, 1 man dies every minute of every day by suicide, and suicide is largely preventable. 1 in 8 men in the UK will be diagnosed with prostate cancer in their lifetime. Testicular cancer strikes young. It's the most common cancer in young UK men. In short, it's not easy being a man. I think that in theological circles, we are trying to think more about masculinity in theological terms. There have been increased attention to masculinity and especially this notion of toxic masculinity. It comes up when we have to consider why gender is so problematic and what can be done with the big questions about transgender persons and same-sex relationships. And these are not easy topics, and you can't just dismiss it. And I recently responded to a roundtable discussion at a recent conference called Behold the Men, which will be published as a book. And it was fascinating to listen to scholars talk about masculinity from various perspectives, all raising issues with what I have been describing as this toxic masculinity, the very narrow view of masculinity that excludes everyone and everything that does not fit into a particular mold or male-female binary world. And it often does this violently. And my question was simple: what does healthy masculinity look like? And you know, I was met with silence. I think we are now faced with this question, not just as a point to reflect on, but as something that we need to put into action. And I expect, and I know that we have had healthy examples all along, but the systems in which we live promote a vision of masculinity and of life that is simply not healthy. To conclude, I would like to take us back to a truth much deeper than gender. And it is this: whoever we are and however we are made in the image of God according to Genesis, according to the scriptures. Male and female, human beings, regardless of who they are fundamentally fully made in God's likeness and are beloved of God. Men are more than just their genitalia or their muscles or their big salaries. They are complex beings living before and in relationship with a God who sees the deep mystery within them. I am not just a man or a male or a father or a brother or a son. I am a soul created by and created for God. Nothing and no one can define that or calculate that except God. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. We're grateful that we could hear you. Oh, David is back, so I'll hand it back to David. For a second, we had lost you, David. So thank you.
Sorry about that. My
Back to you.
internet dropped. Sorry about that, everyone. My internet dropped, but thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Carlton, and for some of the key themes that you began to highlight. And we're going to take some questions from the audience in a few moments, but while we're preparing for that, I'm just going to invite you, if you have any questions, please post them. And if you posted them earlier, please just repost it, because my feed, because I got kicked out by Zoom, has erased the questions. But there's some very positive feedback already saying it was a very insightful and absolutely profound presentation. Just a couple of things just before we I'll throw a few questions at you, please. Just to acknowledge that Nigel Harris, who is the CEO of Tier Fund, is online. And I want to acknowledge Nigel publicly and the wider Tier Fund team for the significant work they've been doing in terms of just pushing the agenda and really having the difficult conversations to ensure that African and Caribbean Christian voices are heard in the UK. So thank you very much for that, Nigel, and for the wider team, for Joe, and also for Kate, who are the technical support at the moment. It's like going to a restaurant, you eat the meal, but you forget sometimes there's someone out there in a hot kitchen that's cooking away and people that's cutting the veg and everything. So thank you very much to those people. And for all of you from all over the world, to Pastor Ebenezer from Nigeria, to Sister Renee, Rev Renee from Cape Town, and people from Bedford and London and Luton and Birmingham and Colombo and all over the world. Thank you very much for joining us. So Dr. Carlton, again, thank you very much, sir, for that fantastic presentation. There's going to be some questions that are going to come in, but one of the questions, you looked at a number of intersections. You looked at maleness and femininity. You looked at maleness and maleness in terms of it being, I put it down to double jeopardy. One of the first questions I want to ask you is this: what is the role of females in the male identity construction project? What roles do female play, given that you talked about power, the intersection between gender and power? So given that there's a power dynamic and a kind of power disparity, what is the role that women play in this identity project that males are involved in, particularly African and Caribbean males? And what is the dynamic that exists between white males and black males when they try to navigate that terrain? Yeah, you're a doctor, so I'm giving you the questions.
You sound like you gave me like two of the hardest questions ever, all in one. Let me try humbly to give a response, not a final answer, but a response.
Thank you.
I think fundamentally this is a complex issue, and I think when we use terms like male and female, they are helpful to a point. And if we know anything about how human beings are constructed, we are not, there's no ideal, there is no central thing that is male. We are just complex. We are a mixture of our mother to put it simply, and our father, our aunties, our grandmothers. I am so much like my mother. I might look like my father, but identity-wise, there are things in me that are like my mother. And it took me time to see that. So we can't just use these terms so easily. And even if we go back to scripture, you have, let's use leadership structures or the way power is used. For example, you have in the Old Testament the story of Elijah, and the king of Israel and Elijah are in a contestation. And the king's wife is called Jezebel. You remember the story of Jezebel. Now, you can't find a more brutal, if we look at the story, militaristic, vengeful kind of leadership style and manipulative than Jezebel. I mean, can we say that all women like that? Certainly no. Because we have courageous women like Deborah who are a judge and a leader. So we can't just put that down to male and female. I think men and women and whoever and however we are bring gifts, a whole range of gifts. In this 20th century, this is the 21st. So in the 20th century, when leadership is largely dominated by men, we increased in technology, and we had a World War I in 1914 to 1918. And we did some, we did some hand-to-hand combat, and men were killed, and we saw the violence in the war. You know what we did in 1939, not too many years after? We had bigger guns and bigger bombs, and we killed more people. Our leaders did that. And just maybe we can have an alternative view of leadership that isn't about winning and competition and being the best, but actually being critical about life for all. And I think in many ways, we need men, women, and human beings who live real lives and actually care. That's my answer to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Let me just press you a bit on something. What role does dialogue play? Because power is, they say power is often never given. And I find in my own experience, and I've seen other people's, that you can talk about Northern Ireland, you can talk about Palestine and Israel, you can talk about Nigeria and the Muslim and Christian dialogue and so on, that where there are deep tensions, there's often a need for dialogue. What does that, what kind of dialogue needs to take place between men and women in order to redefine masculinity in a way that it's not, as you say, about winning, and it's not about power? What does that dialogue look like? And you talked about, the biblical text and the complexity of the biblical text. And then we often see the collusion of males in terms of appropriating the power of the biblical text for that responsibility and so on. So how do we begin to navigate that terrain?
So dialogue is absolutely essential. And I think that the power of dialogue comes from, the best way to describe it is encounter. Even it takes guts to truly open oneself to another who is radically different. But we have to, for not their sake or the sake of the outcome, but for our sake. You learn more about yourself and the illusions you have about yourself. And the only way shifts are happening, this is across the board. This can be in Black-white relationships. This can be male-female relationships. This could be my tribe versus your tribe relationships. You have to sit down and radically open yourself, and encountering the other is also about self-encounter. And the only way things change is when you encounter yourself. As somebody who teaches theology, this is fundamental for us as we train students in ministry, because they're going to go out there and perpetuate a lot of foolishness because they didn't process those deep stuff within themselves. And unless they open, things will remain the same. And that's for ministry and that's for life. So male and females, I think there's a radical, we can't throw each other away. We have to simply encounter. And every step along that deepening journey, we have to be ready to just surrender things that are not helpful. That could be the way we see women and men in very limited ways, and or the way we project onto each other. Or for example, I mean, let me give you a very personal example. As a Black man walking in the UK at night, of a large stature, you know, I joke with people that I'm an elite athlete, you know, and they laugh, but I'm the kind of person, immediately people can see me, and there's some fair women in particular, and there's this caricature of me. They don't know me. And we do this all the time. But if we are in a context in which we can encounter each other in safe ways and vulnerable ways, that's where shifts happen. It's the same for human beings. It's the same for institutions.
Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Carlton. And there's going to be more. There's going to be a panel discussion. I'm sure that Reverend Renee will have some perspectives. And that's why I wanted to introduce this the specificity of the female contribution to this. And thank you for what you shared so far. And one of the things you talked about was the power of encounter and self-encounter. Thought that was really powerful. So thank you very much. Please hang on. We're going to move into a discussion in a short while. But as we said earlier, Deepan have been doing significant work around this whole issue of redeeming and transforming masculinity. And we heard Reverend Dr. Carlton say that the biblical text is complex and it offers different models of masculinity. And now we're going to hear from Brother Prabu Deepan. He's the head of Deepan for the Asia region, and he's based in Colombo in Sri Lanka. He's the architect of an evidence-based initiative to look at how we can transform masculinities and how faith can play a role in terms of the way we seek to navigate gender equality and promote positive masculinities. And this is a project that's going on across 12 countries. So, Brother Prabu, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. And we're just inviting you to share for a short while. God bless you, sir.
Thank you, David. And Happy New Year, everyone. Good evening to you from Sri Lanka. It's a bit gloomy, so I've got my lights on. So if we, hopefully you can stay along and follow, engage with me. Thank you, Dr. Turner. I think powerful words and reflection from scriptures and texts and references related to that. And I think to start off my kind of remarks, I would like to begin with your question, the question that you posed towards the end, which is about what does healthy masculinity is, or what do these alternative masculinities look like? And I think this is a question that we've been wrestling with as an organization in our work, predominantly because we work in contexts where 1 in 3 women are either sexually or physically abused or will experience sexual and gender-based violence in their lifetime. And so really our journey was really trying to understand that. What does it mean for us as an organization working with and wanting to eradicate poverty, but also human suffering in some conflict-affected communities around the world? And I would start that with 2 different reflections. One, as part of my formative research in order to design and explore what could this transform masculinities or working with men and boys discussion look like for us. I was in a community in Burundi, sharing my experiences as well, and really trying to understand how do we engage, what would the most useful way for Deepan to journey with men and women in that community. And I remember this, one person telling me this, and he said, Prabu, we've never seen an alternative way of being men. how can I be something that I have never seen? I've never heard of it. None of the men in my community have been this way. None of the men in, my father wasn't this way. Nobody else in this community has, exhibited or demonstrated what it means to be, man in an alternative way. So how can I be this man? And that was really powerful for me as I was trying to understand how we can journey alongside men and women in those communities as a response at that point to, sexual and gender-based violence. And I knew at that moment, whatever we design, whatever intervention or activities or reflections that we design, promoting an alternative has to be part of that process. And, it was exciting, Dr. Turner, you talked about Jesus, and we really thought that was an alternative. We, as Christians, we aspire towards, wanting to be like Christ in many ways, and thought it'd be really good to, in our interventions and our conversations and dialogues, to dig deep into what kind of a person, a human being, a leader, a man Jesus Christ was, and in a way that is tangible, the way that people can engage with. So that was, embedded in the work that we were doing. On the other side, my personal experience, or why I was, kind of really interested in this work in my own personal journey and transformation, ongoing journey, I must say. I grew up in a violent household. My father was extremely violent towards my mother. So as a child, I decided I will not be a man like my father. I will not be a husband like my father. I will not be a father like my father. But that was me comparing myself to somebody who was extremely violent. It was saying I do not want to be living out these toxic traits or characteristics that I saw in my father. That did not make me a good person, a good man. I was still passive aggressive. I was still really, emotionally manipulative in my relationships in other ways. And this was the two things that I really kind of came into realization in the work that we do with Deepan. When I designed and developed transform masculinities, it is not really continually compare ourselves to violent, the worst kind of behavior out there and saying, oh, I am better than that because I'm not physically violent. It is really looking at what is the alternative, what is the ideal here, what is the intention, what is the imagination in creation that we want to be aspiring towards. And the transforming masculinities work that Deepan leads is really around that. It's really around accompanying men and women. I say men and women both, and I will explain why. It's really imagining an alternative way of being men, men and in relationships, but also just in, around being in different roles that you are, you perform in your day-to-day lives in your communities. Deepan began its work on transforming masculinities in 2013, and by 2015 we realized we need these conversations to go beyond project timelines. These cannot be just one-off conversations where we are like, thank you so much for coming into a workshop, 2 days, 3 days, and expect people are going to transform and change. It doesn't happen that way. This is a lifelong process. We live in a patriarchal society. Therefore, we are indoctrinated, or our masculine identities and ideals and expectations are shaped by that, ideology, where one is dominant over the other, controlling over the other, and it's an unequal power structure and system. So there were a few things that we wanted to do. One is really understand how do we work at the intersection of men and masculinities with faith, but also what is the alternative that we want to promote, and how do these conversations, how can they live beyond the lifeline or the project timelines, so that it becomes part of our day-to-day lives in our churches, in our communities, etc. And it was really important for me then to understand what that looks like. So we thought, really, how do we design an intervention, that expands, starts out the dialogue, accompanies people, but also can live beyond that. So when the transformation process was developed, we realized there were ways that we needed to engage because we work with local faith communities, so local religious leaders and community leaders. And I really wanted to, think about how do we engage these people as religious leaders, because they are men and women themselves. They are shaped and influenced by these ideals, these norms, these attitudes and knowledge that they've grown up with. They're not immune to it. Because my thinking was, I found out in my work, if you give a toolkit or a Bible, reflection or Bible study to a religious leader, they would preach against violence. But it doesn't mean that their lives, they truly believe, or their lives are transformed in the same process itself. So we were thinking, how can we, if these leaders, they believe in equality, then their sermons and messages, the interpretations, the way they accompany their congregations also will reflect that. So it was really important for us in the part of the Transform Masculinity intervention that we start working with religious leaders, not to instrumentalize them or tokenize them or use them, materialize them, but really accompany in their understanding of scriptures and theology, but also in their own journey. And then we would select men and women from the local congregation and train them as we call them champions. They are trained facilitators, really to accompany other men and women in the local communities. We understand that not only men, women also shape and contribute to masculine ideals. There's an expectation. I always joke about this, and my brother always says, when there's a snake in their house, their wife is like, Praveen, there's a snake, why don't you do something? He's like, why do I have to be the one? I don't want to die either. So what I'm saying is that these are not just ideals that are, that we believe as men, but this is expected from us. This is internalized. There's an expectation that we will provide, protect, and there's a certain way of being, and that's internalized as well. And so when we raise children, we raise them in the same ideals as well. So this needed to be a journey together, a dialogue of unpacking what it means to be, how this ideologies, how these attitudes and norms that which are based on this idea of them not being equal, shape our day-to-day realities, day-to-day relationships, and how we interact with one another. We started this as a response to violence because we work in communities where 35-40% of the population of women, mostly disproportionately affected by gender-based violence, and most often perpetrated by men. So there was a real issue that we needed to address. So we needed to look at the linkages there and also explore how do we promote an alternative. We also realized that it is not about teaching men and women on how to use power well. This is not about maintaining status quo. It's not saying, hey, let's maintain these power structures, like these unequal power systems, like, the patriarchal dominance, and within that find leeway to teach people how to use power well. No, it's not. It is working towards dismantling that system in a way and imagining an alternative, a kingdom system that values equal value both men and women and children and their contribution to society, their leadership, their experiences, their gifting, as Dr. Turner said. And so then we take these men and women through 6 weeks of dialogues, which is called community dialogues, where for 5 weeks they meet in single sex groups. So men have their own space with another male facilitator also to unpack their experiences, their lived realities, but also things that they have learned, and women the same way as well. And then the 6th week they come together, ready to have a conversation and a dialogue together with them. What has been really fantastic to see through TFN work is that we've seen significant reduction of violence in places where we work, up to 60% intimate partner violence reduction within 2 years of this work. We've seen increased social cohesion, not only between men and women, but also between people of different faith and communities in Nigeria, in our work in Nigeria, between Muslims and Christians. So what it's saying is that if we can undo this, it won't only improve how we relate to one another, men and women, but also to other people. How we respond and react and resolve conflict at our household is so gendered that also has extends to our communities as well. So it's really exciting to be part of a process where we are journeying alongside men and women in promoting an alternative, new norms, creating new norms, ways that we can be men and women, that is uplifting, enabling, valuing the equal contribution and worth of all people. And I think that's really important. And we see as a result of that, as an outcome of that, reduction of violence. Our plans in going forward is to really look at scaling up this work. We across the world. This is not just an issue that is in my part of the world or in some African context or Asian. It is all over the world, in the UK and beyond. So it's really always exciting when people reach out to us and say, how can we replicate this work in our local communities? I think that's really important because, this is a journey that we have to be on. Explore, looking at scriptures, really looking at scriptures the way Dr. Turner was talking about, because that's a particular version of how we have interpreted this text that is to reinforce, whatever the ideology was for us. And we need to look at alternatively. And primarily to learn to do as a man, enabling us to do this for ourselves. This is not, in human service or to do for women or as a favor to women. This is for me, myself, so I can be a better person. This is for me, so I can raise my son in a different way, so that I can enjoy an experience and I can enable, people around me to thrive to their God-given potential. This is the vision for Deepan's Transforming Masculinity's work, and this has been a really exciting journey for us. And as David mentioned, it's around 12 countries. There are very different interpretations and adaptations given the context, but at the core of it is a journey. It is a journey for men and women together, but also unpacking and unlearning things they have along the way, on their own within their peers and peer groups, but also putting in accountable practices. Just because people are all saying, "Oh, I do not want to use this power," it doesn't go away, because we live in a society and culturally men and are given this power. They have this status, therefore associated impunity as well. So we really are exploring how do we promote accountable practice for both men and women, so that we can hold each other accountable we can journey together in a way. And what is the most exciting thing is that as a result of this work, we've seen significant reduction of violence. So that's kind of what Deepan is doing, and I really hope that you can engage with it. I think we've seen the links to this work shared in the chat. So yeah, it's really exciting, and I invite you, if you're a man who's listening to this, really to check through the resources, some of the guides and the reflections, and see if there's ways that you can engage with that and reflect on this and journey together. So thank you very much. Looking forward to further conversation around this. Back to David.
Thank you, Prabu. It seems like we have lost David again. I don't know if you can see me well. I've got some light behind me, so I might need to turn my camera a little bit. My name is Philip Powell, and I'm part of the Theology and Network team in Deepan, and I'm just stepping in for David today. I think David has lost connection again. So thank you again, David. Thank you for telling us about how you've not only done this work in Deepan, but also how this has been a journey for you personally of redeveloping and transforming masculinities. I'm going to introduce our two panelists. Let me begin by introducing our panelist, Ayo. Ayo is a member of the Wells Advisory Committee and has a specific passion for the intersection between the kingdom and the marketplace. He's an ordained lay minister in the RCCG Church, and he's passionate about how young people can do ministry in multicultural contexts. I'm also excited to introduce our other panelist, Renee August. She lives in the lands of the Khoi and Sans people, South Africa. And Renee, of course, has a great passion for speaking on issues of justice, on reconciliation, and is part of Deepan as a special advisor on peace building. So welcome to Ayo and Renee. We're delighted that we have this panel. I still don't see David, who was supposed to be hosting this. So I'm going to be stepping in here. I'm so sorry that my light is not very good. You just have to work with me in this. Maybe I could start by asking Prabu one follow-up question to what you shared. Would you be able to tell us, maybe very briefly, any success stories that you've had where, having designed this program and having been doing it for a while, one story that says, yes, it has made a difference? And while you're doing that, I'm going to turn on some light here so that people can see my face. Prabu, over to you.
Thanks, Philip. And yes, and I think, as I said, collectively, we've seen significant reduction of violence in places. Like, one of the most exciting findings from some of our work has been 60% reduction of intimate partner violence between people, those who are in partner relationships. And that's exciting. And also people, 83% reduction of non-partner sexual violence. Now, these are numbers, and I'm mentioning these numbers because there's a significant, impact, not only at individual level, but in communities as well. there, one of the stories that I remember is this pastor. His name is Bura, and during the process, we do this activity where you go back home as part of your homework, and you ask your partner, if there was one thing that I could change, what would that be? And it is part, it's day 2 or 3 of the workshop, as a part of training or practicing accountability, right? Like we journey together in relationships. Most often we think you're doing good, but we don't know, we don't get feedback. So it's really about practicing that. He came back the next day. He was in tears. He's saying, Prabu, my wife told me, why are you asking me this? He was in tears. He said, I want your trainer to kick you first. 14 years we've been married. You've never for a single day asked me how I can be a better person. What can I do to change? 14 years. And now you ask me. And he said, Prabu, I realized how much I missed out, not only in my relationship, but with my family, my children. And I think these are things that really demonstrate, not just, the moment where people realize this is impacting us as men as well. Our ways to fully experience life in all of its fullness, to be in relationships, to be able to learn and be vulnerable. And I think, these are stories that there are multiple stories, Philip, that I can share. But these are things, and I remember, working in a multi-faith community, especially in Jos, Plateau State in Nigeria. This imam, he asked his pastor counterpart, and he said, "Can you call my wife and tell her that I am committing today?" He asked this, pastor to say, "Can you call my wife and say I am committing today to change? I want you to tell her so that she knows that I am holding myself accountable." These are two, religious leaders who've never worked with each other. There's a grave in the church, which is from a previous interreligious violence, and here we are in a room together, and them sharing and them coming together. And I think this is the transformational power of God at work in many ways, and the work that the power of dialogue and space that we create for people to think and reflect and unlearn and learn and journey together. And I think these are some stories that I can share, but like this.
Thank you, yeah. Prabu. Really appreciate it. David is back with us, so I'm going to hand it back to David. There's some questions that have come in as well, and I'm sure I'll step in again if David goes missing. But back to you, David.
Yeah, thank you very much. My apologies, everyone. The internet just isn't working today. I'm going to try and use a different space tomorrow. But I think I hope that both Rev Renee and Brother Aya have had an opportunity to introduce themselves. What I just want to say, I'm going to pick up some things from Prabu in a few moments, but just to welcome them to the discussion. And I'm going to ask first, Rev Renee, if you just say something about yourself, and then just give a few reflections on what you've heard so far from Rev Carlton and what you've heard from Brother Prabu. And then I'll do the same with Brother Aya, and then we'll just keep the conversation going. Thank you very much. Welcome. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy, what we sang in South Africa, 2022. It is, it's a joy to be with you, and thank you for the reflections that have already been offered. I would say an amendment on my bio. I am passionate about all things Jesus, not all things justice. It just so happens that my passion for Jesus leads me into spaces where people are not loving one another as they love themselves. And so that's the motivation for being involved in issues of justice. It's because of Jesus, not because of justice. A few reflections. I think the one thing that sort of made me the first thing that made me stop was this listening to the story about Movember and this campaign. And in South Africa, we have Movember as well, and men don't shave for the month of November, and they sort of grow these, ridiculous bits of facial hair in support of the campaign. And then, if they shave, then they have to contribute to the campaign. And just one thing Dr. Turner said was that it wasn't easy being a male. And I think it's for me, that's an important place to pause. Because in this conversation, for me, the issue isn't so much trying to compete around whose life is more difficult, but just to say that it's difficult being alive. And yes, life is difficult for men, but if those same men were not men facing the same issues, their life would be significantly more difficult. And so for me, that's the systemic consequences of patriarchal oppression. And a point of departure, I guess, for me in this conversation is that we are all created in the image of God. All of us are created in the image of God. And so we need to approach this conversation to ask the question, how is it that we can together help reveal this glory and image of God that is innate in every single one of us, instead of, vying for positions that are right or wrong or competing or debating, which then in this comment around encounter becomes important. One amendment I would make to what Dr. Turner said about encounter is that I agree it is encounter, but with whom? The people we are willing to engage with in these encounters, for me, are almost as important as reading scripture itself. Because if they're only a group of men encountering scripture together, it's not going to get us very far in this conversation. It has to be men in conversation with those who are not like them, who are not like them racially, who are not like them economically, who are not like them gendered. And it is in the diversity of that encounter for me that, the magic begins to happen and we are able to see each other.
Can I just ask you, Rev Renee, just to say a little bit more? I know you've got some more to say, but just unpack a little bit more about you talked about the systemic consequences of patriarchal oppression. Can you just break that down a bit further for some people that may not have come across those terms, may not be familiar with that concept? What are you pointing to? And also just say a bit more about, you talked about us being needing to...
Oh, sorry, carry on, David.
You talked about us also being in a place where we needed to almost co-create or rediscover collaboratively this sense of Imago Dei that exists. Just say a bit about those two concepts before I introduce Brother Ayo to come on board and just share a few thoughts as well, reflections. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I would say, again, Dr. Turner used the passage from 1 Kings, the story of Jezebel, as an image of a woman. And he reads that text as a man. I read it as a woman, and I see in chapter 21, King Ahab goes to Naboth to ask him for his vineyard. And then he comes home, and it says he was sulking. Now, this is a man with power who is angry and sulking and not eating. And he's at home with a woman who is a refugee. She has no power. And she has to share a room with an angry, sulking man while she herself is powerless. Let me tell you, I would do exactly what Jezebel did. I would do everything to make sure that his anger was not turned towards me. And so reading the world of the text is as important as reading the text itself. Jezebel gets branded, cruel, evil, lustful for power, controlling, manipulative. But Ahab seems to have no power. Why is he acting like a baby? And so we don't ask those questions when only men read the text together. They go, oh, shame, poor Ahab. And so I would say within the context of these encounters, who we read the text with, where we read the text. Speak to a woman who is a refugee married to a powerful man. And she will give you a very different take on that particular text. And so unless we're willing to listen to voices and perspectives that are very different to ours, we are not necessarily able to see the complexities, not only within the world of the text, but in the text itself. It doesn't offer itself to casual reading. And for us to be encountered with our own bias that we bring to scripture, we need difference to be part of that conversation.
Just a few thoughts as well, please, on Imago Dei. You've already solicited a number of responses to what you're saying, which is what we're here for. So, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Brother Prabu, tying something that Rev Renee said. But just say a bit more, if you can, please, about how we go about possibly co-creating, collaborating in rediscovering this shared sense of Imago Dei. And I'm going to come to you, Brother Aya.
Oh, how we discover that. I think I want to take a step back and say, so what is this idea of us bearing image? In the world of Genesis, as this idea was being communicated, that we created an image of God, image was something that reflected authority. And wherever an image had authority, it would declare or dictate the extent of the reign of that image. And so, you know, in Britain, you have the Queen on your money. You can go to a shop in South Africa, you can't buy anything with pound notes because that image bears no authority here. And so when we're talking about the image of God in another person, we are talking not only about that person, but we're talking about the reign of God extended in the presence of that person, or through the presence of that person, or by virtue of the presence of that person. And so how do we extend the reign of God, for me, is a bigger question than how do we co-create spaces where we can celebrate the image of God in one another. Because when I dismiss you, David, or neglect to listen to you, or diminish you in any way, I'm declaring war against God. And so me creating space, not only to host you, but to allow you to host me. As we do that work, so we enlarge the space where we make the glory of God more visible. We make the presence, the image, the reign of God. I don't like to use the word kingdom because it genders God in the masculine. So we extend the reign of God on earth as it is in heaven because of how we treat one another.
Do you think, Rev René, and I'm going to come to Brother Aya in a minute, but you just said something that I instinctively want to just explore. You expressed a caution about the competitive nature of the inequalities that are characteristic of maleness or femaleness. It came out in the story of Jezebel and the way it was read, you said by Dr. Carlton, and the way it's being reread by you, which is gendered, as you said, in your framework. Do we not fall into the same danger if, because I'm thinking, I asked about how we co-create and how we collaborate. Mm-hmm. If we place a greater importance on discerning the reign of God through the different genders, if we prioritize that over creating a space where those genders, where those groups can get together and have the conversation, are we not falling into the same trap of prioritizing one over the other when both are mutually as important as the other?
Mm-hmm. I would say yes. I think we all bring different gifts to this encounter. And so it is in the areas where we carry our own passion together that we then get a picture of the whole. I think the abuse of power, I want to name it as that, happens in the intersections, not so much in isolation. It doesn't happen within individuals. There's systems, and where those systems conspire and intersect, that's where we find the gravest injustices happening. And so it is in those places that we need to engage and mitigate against this abuse of power. But I certainly, from my own experience, I know I'm not perfect. I get this wrong all the time. And so that's why I need you, David. That's why we need each other.
Amen,
to and continue the conversation, and for me to be checked by others so that I can measure my own responses in that way.
Thank you very much for that, and for taking the conversation. Dr. Carlton, I'm going to come back to you and Brother Prabu in a minute. I just knew that Rev René will have something to a perspective to bring, and so will Brother Aya, and then we'll just take a few questions and pick it up again. And I'm going to come to you first in a moment after Brother Ayo speaks, Brother Prabu, I'm going to come to you. So, Brother Ayo, it'd be lovely to hear what some of your reflections have been, even on what you've heard from Reverend Renee as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend David, and thank you so much for your reflections, Dr. Turner, and also Reverend Renee, and also Prabu as well. I think it's interesting. I think you listen to the conversation that we've had, and as much as it is thought-provoking, I think it's also challenging in many ways. And I think for me, particularly given that my profession, I work in the D&I space, or the diversity and inclusion space, in the HR space. We're grappling with these issues within the marketplace day to day. So to have a theological discussion about this, I think, is very refreshing. I think some of the things that have really stood out to me, and I'll pick out just a couple because of time, but your reflection, Dr. Turner, on testicular cancer being the major killer, or the highest cancer killer of young men, I think is in itself very, very ironic, given that the virility of young men, is something that you kind of hold up there as essentially as a kind of post or signal of their power, of their energy, and yet the one thing that signifies and embodies in the physical sense their masculinity, their virility, is the one thing that actually is the biggest killer. So I think in many ways that sense of vulnerability is something that really was quite striking. I wasn't aware of that. And I think, the second thing I wanted to really kind of touch upon or retouch upon was Reverend Renee's reflection on the Jezebel story. And I think the wider issue that we have when interpreting scripture through the lens of what has been an exclusively male-written book, male-written scripture. And I think the story that kind of really comes to mind is the story of Hagar and Ishmael, and how that was written through the perspective of Abraham's story and the desire for the promised child, and when obviously the promised child arrived, the kind of shunting aside of Ishmael. But it's the story of Hagar, when we look at Jehovah Rohi and where the origins of Jehovah Rohi, God who sees, comes from. It comes from that account and that story, and God saw the plight of Hagar, which is why he sent the angel to appear to her in that encounter. And God sees things in a way that we don't. And I think even in that story in itself, we see that. And I think that what Reverend Renee says, in terms of, in her position, she reads that scripture and she sees Jezebel's plight and Jezebel's story more clearly than we might do, looking at it from our perspective as males. I think it's quite an important thing that when we do read the scripture, let's look at all angles. Let's look at things with a wider perspective, a 360 perspective, when we're interpreting scripture. But I think for me, this conversation is one that it's great to be having within the theological space, because it's a conversation that's been had, again, referencing Dr. Turner's previous point, it's a conversation that's been had in every area. It's been had in business, it's been had in science, it's been had in politics, it's been had in the marketplace, in business, in the area where I work, and it needs to be a conversation that we grapple with within the theological space as well. Because if we don't, then what happens is that essentially these conversations and the overarching thinking and the framework thinking that drives these conversations, we have no input into, and it's important that there is a biblical perspective on this.
Thank you very much for that, Brother Ayo. And let me just ask you one other question just before I go to Brother Prabu, and then I'm going to get Brother Reverend Turner in as well. You're the youngest person on this platform, and I know you're vying for that position, Rev, but you must tell the truth according to scriptures. To some degree, Dr. Turner talked about historical representation of masculinity. There's lots of literature now about progressive masculinities. Brother Prabu talked about his own internal sense of dissociation, i.e., he wasn't going to be like his father, but because he wasn't physically abusive, doesn't mean he was idealistic in his masculinity. Where do you find yourself as a millennial, as a man that's emerging in the midst of almost two cultures, at least, that are contesting notions of masculinity?
I think for me it's quite interesting because when you use the word culture, I'll use the word cultural overlay in terms of my African background. I think that still holds quite strong, even though I am a millennial, even though I'm in my early 30s. I definitely think that, unlearning some of the more toxic traits of masculinity and patriarchy isn't something that's going to happen immediately. And I'm going to be open and frank, but even within our generation, I'm going to be open and frank about, although I do think that we are on a journey of evolution as to how we see gender and how we in turn are going to play that out in our households as young men, rearing families. I think for me, one of the things that I think is that, yes, there are things that I saw, with my parents growing up, or I've seen with the baby boomer generation that I definitely will be keen to unlearn or to absolve myself of going forward. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that, there are so many things that subconsciously are embedded based on kind of what I've been nurtured with and what is kind of been in my environment growing up, that it's not going to be a straightforward thing. And I think that's particularly the case because of my cultural background. So whilst, I've imbibed and understand the Western culture, which, although it's still quite paternalistic, quite patriarchal, is probably moving in a quicker direction. I think moved in the opposite direction quicker, I would say. But I definitely think that cultural overlay is definitely something that's not going to make my journey necessarily as quick as anyone else's, just because I happen to be a millennial. So I definitely think that's a factor that needs to be borne in mind across the board for all millennials, or even Generation Zers to look at generation below me.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, because I think when push comes to shove, it's about power, isn't it? And men love power. And Brother Prabu, you talked within your presentation about, I highlighted earlier that you saw physical abuse. Thank you for that, Brother Ayo, by the way. You talked about seeing physical abuse and saying you're not going to be that kind of person, but still recognizing that there was something that was far from, not even ideal, but far from what you wanted to embrace about what it meant to be a man. The question that came to me immediately is, how did you navigate that will? Not only is not just willful blindness, but that internal resistance. It reminded me of Romans chapter 7, where Paul says, the things I don't want to do, I do. The things I love. How did you practically say, I have to realize, you said you were passive aggressive, and you said that you were also manipulative. How did you have the courage to confront yourself and own this as an intrinsic part of your masculinity and begin to journey forward?
Thanks, David. I mean, I sound a lot wiser when you put that way. I think all of this wisdom in retrospective, right? You learn and you look back and say, I was that guy. And I think my point being is that most often men come into this conversation because they think violence is bad, beating a woman is bad, rape is bad, all of that. But none of them are willing to, put in the work that needs to unlearn how they contribute to this behavior. So we have lots of campaign that says, engage men, and so I came into this work from that perspective. Our focus was on me and my contribution and my kind of magnanimous, effort to eradicate violence against women and girls by, doing things for them, not really focusing on my life as an individual. And sometimes pre-positioning ourselves opposite of something bad doesn't make us good. I think, like I said, my father. So for me, as I started to, develop these interventions, we would do fatherhood programs, my previous work, where we will teach men and say gender equality is when you are more involved with, taking care of children and household work. And I realized how difficult that was. They were detached from the reality of how they viewed women, because it reminded me of Dad, who was a great cook, but also he was physically violent towards my mother. They had nothing to do with each other. So for me, it was looking at those things and being called out sometimes, being part of groups and decentering yourself, when you're journeying alongside other women. And then I remember my first kind of gathering with survivors in South Africa. Cheerfund's work always starts with listening to survivors' voices, female survivors, because most of our work has been around that. And I remember one person looking at me and saying, Prabu, you are a thorn. I'm a male survivor myself. I've been sexually abused and displaced because of war in this country, etc. But their experience with men have been so difficult. 3 generations of women who have experienced sexual violence. And for me, then at that moment, I felt so. I started to think about, this is not about me. This is about her experience. What do I do with this information? What do I do with this perception about me? And starting to unlearn that, because I knew in reality, the day-to-day realities of women, like my mom, my sister, other women in this community, is nothing. It's my oppression or violence that I experience is not systemic as what women experience. And I think as much as this is not a competition with who experience violence the most, but in a patriarchal state and a system, we know it disadvantages mostly women and girls, or those who are not performing hegemonic masculinities. So I think it's really important for us to understand that. So for me, I think it's being listening in and being called out and getting things wrong and knowing that this is not about me. I do not position myself as somebody who's got it figured out. I'm on this journey because I can easily be that guy like my dad and nobody will question me because I'm not different to him. That we quickly, other men who do these things and say, I'm not like them, I'm a good guy. But we realize that we are on the spectrum as well. We live in a system and a society that accepts our behaviors, and the bar is so low for me as a man. So I think it's really important that I allow myself to be called in and called out, but also sit with those uncomfortable feelings of how I experience and how I use power and my vulnerabilities as a man as well. And understanding that in relation to men's experiences, but also in relation to the wider society, the intersectionalities that lots of you talked about. So I think it sounds very kind of fluffy, like at this moment, but it was really hard process because you deeply hurt people, and you genuinely believed you were a good person, and I think in a way that it's just so undoing. But it's taking that energy and emotion, thinking about what do I do with that information? What do I do with these experiences in a way that I can allow for people to come into that space and journey alongside other men and women so that I can continually improve. And I can be, my son who's 11 years old knows ways of being that is not defined, or boxed in, can fully express himself and know, so I think all of these things just really make sense to me. And I think I'm grateful that Deepan has given me the opportunity to work on this, but I think I benefited mostly than most of the communities that I work in because it's my personal journey that continues to improve.
Thank you very much, Brother Prabu. Very insightful. I'm going to come to you in a few moments, Rev Renee, because I want you to just help us understand how this notion of power, just offer some reflections on how we might begin to handle power in a far more constructive way, because it's always going to be there. And you've had lots of experience. I'd love it. But brother Ayo talked about his culture. Brother Prabu talked about his culture. Obviously, Dr. Turner has alluded to his culture in his bio and in other things. But also, Brother Prabu talked about being called out and called in. And in the most generous way, we might have said that today, in your reading of Kings, you are either called out or called in the way that is necessary in these conversations. Is there some reflection that you would like to offer? I don't mean a defense, but is there a learning that's taken place? Is there an instinctive response that you had to something that Rev Renee said when she talked about interpreting the Second Kings text? And just to say, those of you who've got questions, please post them, because when I got locked out, it's disappeared. So just ask you if there's anything that Dr. Turner, you'd like to just not offer as a defense, but as an extension of the conversation. And that's why I want Rev Renee to come in with some thoughts about power as we begin to close down. So thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's nothing to defend, really. We will always see the text differently. In fact, I was very excited when she started to lay out the text in the way that she did. And I said, wow, I never thought that.
Lovely.
And me bringing up the text was kind of, it was just an example. And obviously I didn't go into it as deeply as I wanted. But the fact that, and as a contextual theologian, the fact that we can step by step see a bigger picture is what makes me happy. Because these are complex stuff. There's no saint or hero here. Even Elijah, even the man of God, is deeply flawed. So I welcome that really. And I really wish that that could happen more in spaces that I engage with, whether that's training ministers, whether that's in parish ministry, Anglican priest parish ministry, or in decisions that we make in our organization. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you. I really welcome that.
And I think to you, thank you for the spirit in which you received it, and also to Reverend René for the courage to call it out, because often as a Black male, you're numerically, culturally dominated, and in one sense, being the only woman on the panel, there can be that sense, but to have the courage and the tenacity and the grace to call it out, and for Dr. Turner to respond in the way that you did, and just even some of the things that Brother Aya said and Brother Prabu, we're modeling something here that is transformative in itself. It's not, we talked about it not being combative, and you've all really modeled that. I want to say thank you for that. So, Rev René, can you offer us just a few thoughts on power? Because I think when push comes to shove, this is one of the core themes that we're having to navigate. You talked about systemic oppression and so on. Just offer us a few thoughts as we begin to wind down, please.
Oh, that's a big question. Thank you, David. And I want to say to Dr. Turner, thank you. Yeah, I enjoy engaging, and I have things to learn. And there were some things that you said that I deeply appreciate, but didn't have a chance to respond to necessarily. I think in terms of power, I've spent some time, especially reading the Gospels, through the lens of the movement of power. How do we see power moving from what to what, from whom to whom, as a consequence of the presence, the words, the actions, the location of Jesus? So the Christmas story that we just read over and over again during the season, I don't know, for each gospel writer, there's a geography to where they place Jesus. There's the census so that they can tax people, and the wise ones, the three wise men, go where looking for Jesus? To the palace of a king, because they hear, oh, a king is going to be born. And then this disruption of the narrative that, oh no, it's in Nazareth. That place where can anything good come from there? So the geographical location of this king being born is already a disruption of power. And then the angels herald this message. And it's this cosmic heavenly sign, but it's revealed to shepherds. Can I say almost wasted on a bunch of homeless guys living outside in the field with stinky animals. And then they are told, and this will be the sign. You will find a baby in a golden bed in robes of silk. No. You'll find a baby wrapped in strips of cloth lying in a manger. How is that even a sign from heaven? So the question of power is, where do we look for power? And where do we look for revelation? The biblical text clearly over and over and over locates these signs, these revelations, this presencing, the coming of the reign of God on earth as it is in heaven, happening in places of economic powerlessness, geographical powerlessness, social powerlessness, racial powerlessness. Jesus is born in the body of a hated race. And so how do we think about power? Well, I'm the only woman on this panel. This is not a knock at anybody, but we're wanting to have these conversations, then let's say, okay, where's power located on this panel? And how can we disrupt the systemic power by inviting a younger woman's voice, someone who doesn't have a title in front of their name, maybe, and hear their perspective, invite.
Oh, I think Rev René may have frozen. I thought it was me for a quick second there. So sorry, Rev René, if you've frozen. But just in closing, we've got 1 minute. Brother Aya, do you want to give a quick... Sorry, Reverend, I'm just going to let you finish just 20 seconds, and I'm going to come to Brother Aya as well. You were talking about the distribution of power and disrupting it on this panel. That's what the last thing we heard from you. I think it's going to be problematic. So thank you for that, Reverend. If you come back, Brother Aya, you've heard some of the things around power. You heard what are some of your thoughts as we close?
It's such a shame. I thought Reverend Renee was on such a roll, and I think that she was really onto something. I really do think she was onto something. I think even if we mirror it to Jesus' triumphant re-entry into Jerusalem, we don't see him riding in on a white stallion, armor plated. We see him riding in on a donkey, and with palms, hence Palm Sunday. So I really do think that re-examination of, where power truly resides is a really important place to end this conversation on, because ultimately, when we look at the interaction over the ages between men and how we assert power and how we've come to the place we're at where we're looking to unpack masculinity in a more progressive way. We're looking to detoxify masculinity. Power and how we relate to power is at the heart of that discussion. So really, I wish we could revert back to Reverend Renee, because what she was saying was bang on the money, to be honest. But yeah, just to throw my 2 cents there, I think any reassessment of this is going to have to center around how we discuss power.
Well, I have to bow to the people that have power who are telling me we're running out of time. So I want to say thank you to all of you. Each of you could have been panelists that we spent an hour and a half with. And I say that to say thank you for the grace, the humility, the warmth, the generosity of spirit, the integrity of spirit as well, actually, in terms of how you've heard one another and offered radically different perspectives, and just that modeling of how we are able to correct and expand on narratives that came as Reverend Renee and Dr. Carlton had that dialogue. The self-critical reflectiveness that they both Doc and Rev expressed, but also Brother Aya and Brother Prabu, in terms of talking about how their own cultural conditioning makes a difference in terms of the way that they try to navigate the whole issue of masculinity. So I want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you to Tearfund again. Thank you to Joe. Thank you to Kate. Thank you to Nigel and the team. Thank you to everyone that's participated. Just a few announcements, just to let you know, every morning at 7 a.m. There's prayer. So please feel free to join us at 7 a.m. There's a live show every evening at 8 p.m. And there's the 3 p.m. drive time on Premier Radio. If you've got any feedback, please feel free to send your feedback to kate.morton@tearfund.org. I'm going to ask them just to put that in the chat box. Or if you want to stay behind for a few moments and just give some verbal feedback, we'll be more than happy to take that feedback from you. But we just want to say thank you very much for being an interactive audience. Thank you very much for being fantastic panelists, and just been an absolute pleasure to have you join us this afternoon. And maybe you want to stay behind for a few moments. Those of you that asked a question, you weren't able to get your question asked, then please stay behind. And I think our panelists will be happy to just give you a minute or two, maybe 5 or 10, and we'll just have a conversation. But for those of you that have got to go from 10 o'clock, from 1:30, I want to say thank you very much and God bless you. See you tomorrow at 12 to 1:30 p.m. God bless, and the Lord be with you. Thank you very much. Excuse me.
The pandemic isn't over. Millions of people living in poverty are still trying to recover from the devastation of COVID-19.
People have lost loved ones, their homes, their jobs. Thousands can never go back to the lives they once had. Our mission is to follow Jesus where the need is greatest. responding to crisis and partnering with local churches to bring restoration to those living in poverty.
In partnership with Tear Fund, the Well seeks to encourage and empower those suffering the effects of the pandemic to discover for themselves the tools and the resources they need to recover together.
Please act now. We cannot afford to wait. Text RECOVER to 70122 to give £17 or visit tearfund.org/recover. Your gift could provide a family with health training and food support for 3 months. Give today and let's recover together from COVID-19. Thank you.
If you'd like to give towards that initiative towards the world, please feel free to just click on the link that will come into the chat box now, and you can feel free to give. And if you know anyone that hasn't been able to join us today, who may be interested in giving to this platform of African and Caribbean and Asian Christians coming together and talking about issues of international development, then please send it on to them. But this is a fantastic opportunity for you to do that as well. So thank you. If you need to go, please feel free. But if you want to give some verbal feedback or you just want to touch base with one or two panelists for a short while, then it's not planned, but I'm gonna ask if the tech team can just make that happen. Just post your question and then we can just have the question kind of directed to the appropriate person. Thank you and God bless. If you have any questions, just post them in the chat box and we'll pick them up, or the Q&A. There's a question here by Susan Rock. How do the panelists feel about the current debate around the demasculation of men, and is the elevation of women or perceived elevation of women threatening to the role of men? So the first question: how do panelists feel about the current debate of the demasculization of men, and does the elevation of women threaten the role of men? If Rev Renee is on, I would ask Rev Renee to just say something to that. And then after that, I'll ask Dr. Carlton to say something to that as well. And then Brother Prabu. Oh, brilliant. So please, go ahead, please, Rev Renee. Thank you. And thank you for staying.
Hi. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what people mean when they talk about the demasculinization. I don't even know what that word is. I think so. One example that comes to mind is during COVID, for example, as an Anglican priest, some of us started offering Eucharist services online. And some people were like, oh, how's that going to work? You know, because the elements are like, how does that even work? And someone then said, oh, I see, you just demystifying the wafer. And I said, no, we're not demystifying anything. We are remystifying the body of Christ, which is us. And so when you have privilege and it's taken away, it seems like something is being lost or stripped away. But I also see in this process of calling into question our understandings of masculinity an opportunity to rehumanize masculinity. So Prabu uses the language rediscovering, because so much of our understanding of what is masculine and what is not masculine has been tainted by so many, I would even add colonial systems to it. And I don't know who else is on the call, and I don't want to open a hornet's nest, but I thank you that Dr. Carlton had already started opening this. There's some cultures where they recognize 5 genders, not 2.
Wow.
A man with a spirit of a man with a spirit of a woman, an intersexed person, a woman with a spirit of a man, and a woman with a spirit of a woman, for example. And in those cultures, naming happens in different ways. it is in every African indigenous language, there are no male and female pronouns, for example. And so even this construct of what is masculine and what is feminine is something that has come to us because of European languages that dominate our language and education that have male and female as binaries. And so within the binary, we find the problems. And so even now, I mean, Ayo was saying that as a millennial, you sit with the same issues, but I would say the advantage of the time we find ourselves in now is that science and biology has caught up with us in this particular conversation, that they are now biologically classified XXY, you know, people who are neither male nor female, but are both at the same time, that there's enough chromosomes. Castasemia is another example. Someone whose body produces more testosterone than the average man. So if testosterone is responsible for attraction, for example, you know, what do we do with the fact that she has this abnormal, whatever that is, abnormal amounts of testosterone, when we had people like Billie Jean King and Martina Navratilova, and science couldn't help us at that time. But now science has caught up with psychology and is able to enlarge this conversation so that within this continuum of binaries, we're now finding ourselves needing to catch up theologically. And that's where Imago Dei becomes important, because if we say that Castasemina and Martina Navratilova are not created in the image of God, then we must acknowledge another creator. For me, that's a much bigger problem.
Wow.
So yeah, I like I said, I didn't want to open a hornet's nest.
No, but that's honestly, if we need to have these conversations, you've opened my eyes. I thought you've opened my eyes to a number of things, and I'm going to go and buy a book or two actually on the basis of what you said around the five expressions of personhood, as it were. But look, that was brilliant.
There's a book called The Creation of Gender, written by a Ghanaian woman, that you might find helpful.
The Creation of Gender. Thank you very much. I'm going to see if I could post that while Dr. Carlton, Brother Prabu, Brother Aya, anybody else want to offer a perspective on the contribution about men being demasculated and women being elevated above men? There's 31 people that are staying behind. Last year we had an hour. We thought it wasn't enough. This year we've got an hour and a half. Next year I think we're going to move to 2 hours. But please, I'll start with Brother Carlton, then Brother Aya, and then Brother Prabu.
Yeah. So I'll begin with this issue of binary. I have serious issues with binary and dichotomy. And when you study colonial, just how the colonial mindset operates, what it does is it creates an image that is simply not true and will never be true, and violently excludes, occludes, ignores reality. Let me give you an example of that. So in my cultural context, in plantation slavery, I'm from the Bahamas. And the system that is both state and religious dictates that there is a structure, and in that structure, you either in or out. And if you're Black, you are not in any way. And how that works is, even when we had liturgy, as an Anglican priest, our churches even coming into the 20th century, up to the 1940s and 50s, we had sections for Black people, sections for white people. We go into the same God, to the same altar, but you don't sit in that particular section. That is violent. And it's that dichotomy that is a problem. Now, there's a deeper issue, and I guess when it comes back to what Reverend Renee has been saying all along. It comes back to whoever we are, there is a deep mystery to who we are, and we are made in the image of God, and God loves us in all of our complexity. But nobody can put anybody else in a particular box because God doesn't. And colonial systems do just that, put us in a box. I would imagine a world, I keep coming back to this image within apocalyptic literature, and it's there over and over again. Isaiah 11, Revelation 21, and there's this image of the flourishing of all on God's holy mountain, or God. There is no predator, there's no prey, there is simply God with God's people, and all sorts of things are going on. And there is space, and the things we think are dichotomous just aren't anymore.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
No, I'm gonna thank you for that. I know you could go on. I just want to give it's people are hanging on because they want to hear, and just want to say for those who wanted to speak, Sister Susan and so on, that facility doesn't exist, but your comments are being acknowledged, and we'll review and reflect on some of the contributions and things that you've raised. So don't think you're being silenced. It's just a safety thing for everyone, so that we can just make sure that people feel that they're not just being they're being protected, and we're just taking that as a kind of safeguarding thing. So Brother Ayo and Brother Prabu as well, please.
So just to kind of remind myself of the question, I'm going to read it out again. It's, how do the panelists feel about the current debate of the demasculization of men? Are women's elevations threatening the role of men? Now, it's a question that actually rises up again and again and again in my workplace, in terms of what I face day to day when we're dealing with historically underrepresented groups. And I think the predominant issue that I see with this question is that it sees the elevation of men, or women rather, as a zero-sum game. So, i.e., if women are elevated, therefore men must lose in some way. Which, taken aside, the really well expatiated, thoughts that Reverend Renee gave us on the actual complexities behind, seeing gender in such a binary way. The reality is that zero-sum game isn't actually the case at all. And actually, if we look at this statistically, even if we are saying, right, we've done a lot of work to advance, the cause of gender equality as an example, or let's say racial equality as an example, as we are trying to do in the workplace, the fact is that the system is still very, very much controlled and very much systemically geared towards a specific group. So, I think it's very, very important that when we talk about, elevation of one group, or has feminism gone too far, or has this agenda gone too far, that we still actually assess in real terms what the impact of the work that's being done to advance different underrepresented groups is actually doing, and actually seeing that, for example, if I look at this from a corporate perspective, we still have, at the most senior level, representation on average of about 20% of women in C-suite positions, or Black people still not being represented adequately in leadership positions, or Asian people, or disabled people, or people from a low socioeconomic background. So I think we've got to be very careful when we're debating this, actually debate this with proper data to support assertions like, the demasculation of men, and elevation of specific groups threatening others. I just think that we've got to be a bit careful when we discuss these things. So that would just be my perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I like Charles Taylor. He talks about the politics of recognition and the politics of difference. And I think there's something about recognizing. I think what we fail to do is to recognize that imago Dei in women, or we recognize it in other men or in other groups. And actually what God's calling us to is not to devalue anyone and, overvalue another, but to actually recognize the lens through which we see the world, that actually causes us to inadvertently sometimes devalue others. Brother Prabu, love to hear from you. We'll take one more question after this, and then otherwise, I know you guys will keep us here till 6 o'clock. So one more question after this. Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thank you everyone to the contribution. I think it's quite interesting in my work. I always get posed these questions. For example, when you're talking about gender-based violence, and people will say, "What about men?" And I always find that the origin of these questions do not come from a deep concern for men. It comes from a place of denial of women's experiences. I always ask, like, if you are so concerned about male violence, why don't you do something about it? I think because we see everything in a binary and a dichotomy. If women are empowered, that means it has to come at the cost of disempowering men. And we look at this from a finite worldview, where we are talking about is actually restoration of women's image in the way God created. It's not taking away from somebody, it is re-understanding so we can restore to the way God created the Imago Dei image in a way. Genesis 1:26-28, I think in 28 it says, then he made the male and female and said, have dominion over all of creation, not each other. The system that, dominates each other. And I think it's really important that we don't post this, it comes from, I feel it comes from a place of fear. And we see this in every conversation where there is power, whether it's around race, around gender, whether it's around nationalities, when we talk about empowerment of those who are marginalized and oppressed or on the margins, those who are holding privilege and power always feel like they're losing their identity. And we see this, shaping all of our debates even currently across the world, political debates, whether it's around refugees, whether it's around race, whether it's around gender, So I think it's really important. I do not see it the same way. And I think there's a deep fear in men as well, because they feel now that I have to give up my privilege and power. And I think it is not demasculinizing or emasculating men. It is really re-understanding the way we are created, so learning to be in equal partnership and relationships. I think sometimes we are so imbalanced. Balance looks like equality, looks like inequality. So I think it's really important that we live in a world that is already broken, so that restoration and reimagination of that world could actually feel like, this is not ideal for me, therefore this is not what God intended. I think it's really important to recognize we are renegotiating and replicating and kind of trying to reimagine within these parameters, where we want to see our work is that we break these boundaries and re-understand from the way we were created. And that might feel unsettling for people. It might feel unsettling for me. We do this powerful activity towards the end of our work, which we call an ideal community, where we ask the men and women at the end of the 6 week to close their eyes and imagine a world where there's no violence. And we say, what do the men look like? What are the men doing in this community? What are the women doing in this community? What are the children? Because we realize a world that is not violent for women is not violent for men or children. A world where women are thriving is also a world where men are thriving and children are thriving. And I think it's really important that we imagine that, and don't play into this, a dichotomy that we feel like if we do promote this for one person, somebody's got to do something. Yeah. So that's kind of, our experience and my personal point of view around this. And I think it's important.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go in this order. We'll go to Rev. Dr. Carlton, then we'll go to Rev. René, then we'll come to Brother Prabu, and then we'll close with a few thoughts from Brother Ayo. And the question is this: do you think that because of the way society has played out the masculinity of males and the pressures females have, there is now a narrative of people wanting to redefine their sexuality, or is it something else? I'm going to see if I could just get somebody to just, it's a question that came earlier from Maria. If Kate or Joe, if you could just take that question and post it again so that the panelists can see it. Do you think that because of the way society has played out the masculinity of males and the pressures females have, there is now a narrative of people wanting to redefine their sexuality, or is this something else? I'm reading it, and it will be posted to you, but I'm reading it as the questioner asking the way that maleness and masculinity is being redefined, and the way that femininity and women are beginning to develop their sense of power and place. And is there a sense in which this seems to me someone pointing towards the issue of transgender identity and all the various expressions of diversity of sexuality within our society. I hope you can post that so that the panelists can read into it whatever they feel is there for themselves. But so just go to you. I think I said Brother Carlton, Rev René, Brother Prabu, and then we'll go to Brother Ayo as well. Thank you very much.
Man, just quickly, if the person were to, I'd be asking questions about these questions.
Okay.
What do you mean? I just do not understand exactly what's being driven at, and I don't want to assume. The only thing I could say here is that, we don't live in a fixed and static history, and we don't live in a fixed and static existence. That's just across the board. And things have been changing and contested and fought for and denied, and I just don't believe in a world in which everything has been fixed.
Okay.
And that's it. And we just have to wrestle with that fact.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna ask Rev René, I'm gonna ask everyone to just be a minute or so that we can just let people go and let you go as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Yes, again, there's so many layers in this question. I would say if it is speaking to the question of the LGBTIQ plus community, I want to reiterate what I said. I think until now, there were only conversations. Now we actually have hard data that is genetic, that is biological, that is psychological. There's an interdisciplinary reality that we now have to deal with. Even in biblical times, there were people called eunuchs. The Ethiopian eunuch is baptized by Philip in the book of Acts. And eunuchs were people who had ambiguous genitalia as one definition. They're also people who, but there was a host of people recognized as eunuchs who embodied this kind of conversation that we're having here. And so, that's all I would say. I think this is, if it's a direct question on that, then that would be my response. And we
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Brother Prabu and then Brother Aya, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with everyone else. I think the question I feel conflates gender and sexuality, just gender, identities and sexual orientations. I think it's really interesting to see. I think in general, there is a wide understanding that, we've always looked at our identities through binaries. There is an understanding to expand those narratives, in many ways. And I think that's, people are trying to understand. And sometimes when we are trying to understand something, we use what we know. For the same way people interpret scriptures is from their lens of what they have been socialized. So they try to find a narrative that fits that ideology. And the same way with, gender identities as well. People like, how do I process this in a way? I think if I interpret the question as a way that because of the focus on violence, etc., there's a need for people to really understand their identities. In a positive way, I would flip this question and say people are like, we are talking about toxic masculinities now because there's a focus on in reaction to a problem. It didn't come from some me getting up one day and saying I want to be a better man. It came from a place where people saying you have caused this pain. And for me to understand why am I causing this pain to myself and others around me? Why are we as men causing this pain? Why am I as a person of color? What is my kind of intersectional kind of identity and how I interact with power and privilege? So complex as a minority in this country as well. That's kind of me trying to understand that identity. I would say it's a positive thing. But obviously, if this question is about sexual orientation and gender identities, it's definitely, I think there's a lot of things that's going on there, which Dr.
Okay.
Renee.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brother Prabu. Brother Aya.
I don't think there's much else to add from what's been said from my perspective. I do, the conflation between gender identity and sexuality does mean that the question is quite a vast question. You're having to unpack and unpick so many different things. And also, I think the reality is that society is not, is not a singularity. When we talk about society, what do we mean? What societies are we talking about? I think that it's really important when we're having discussions about this, that we're precise, so we don't find ourselves, having to, negotiate or dictate the terms of this discussion, whether we're talking about this in relation to, people having gender identity changes and the myriad of reasons, that could be underpinned, whether it be psychological, biological, there could be so many different reasons, So I think that, everything's been said that needs to be said. So I won't say anything. It would be interesting to kind of hear, what the person is really kind of driving at with this question, and in the one-on-one conversation, perhaps be able to unpack it a bit more. But I think everything's been said that needs to be said.
Well, let me just say finally, thank you to all of you. Thank you to Brother Prabu. Thank you to Brother Aya. Thank you to Reverend Dr. Turner. Thank you to Reverend Renee. And not just for your contributions, but for showing us that the issues at hand are not as simple as we sometimes believe they are. For modeling to us a humility and the courage to be able to say that we don't have all the answers, but we move confidently in a direction, knowing that we're guided by a recognition of the humanity of others, the image of God in others, and a sense for justice across our society. So this has been fantastic. It's half an hour after time, and there doesn't seem to be any sign. We stabilized at around about 29:30. So we've got 50% of people still online since the time began. So I just want to say thank you very much for all of your contributions, and God willing, in the future, we'll be able to get maybe two of you on at a time, or even one, and do something offline and just post it as a resource so that we can get more out of all of you. Thank you for the generosity and the kindness, the way you've modeled respect and generosity if you dealt with one another. God bless you. Have a good day, and we look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Bless you.